I have a small agenda for you today, kind of an introduction to this whole thing, and then we will dive into Azure DevOps, where we will be doing most of the work in this session. We'll be creating code, obviously, on the laptop or computer. And then we will create pipelines, branches, pull requests, releases, and rollbacks in Azure DevOps. The example in today's session is an Azure function, demonstrating how you could do that with other things as well, SQL databases and so on. But the main example for this session is an Azure function. So my name is Jens. I'm, as Mark stated, head of Dev and Ops in Catman Solution. I used to be a programmer. I've moved into the BI space in 2003 and have been working with point of sales data for 10 plus years now. I'm a data platform MVP, and I have several certifications that I actually use bits and pieces of in my everyday work. In Catman, we serve a number of international local customers, serving about 200 different data streams coming in. And you might know some of them, and some of them are local to us. We span the Nordics and have been doing so for 20 years. And that's the end of the slideshow for this session. So we'll quickly dive into Azure DevOps. And what you see here is a project that I created. So I have signed up for Azure DevOps with Catman Solution. And as you can see, we have a number of projects in here. I've created one for the hybrid virtual group. You can start by describing the project that you would do your work around so that you can introduce it to members, maybe stakeholders and so on. And you can build up kind of a landing page for the project. You can also create dashboards, and you can create analytic views that you can actually consume in Power BI. So you can report in your most favorite reporting tool, which would obviously be Power BI. And you can do a lot of other stuff in Azure DevOps. The main parts that we will be concerned about is this boards, repos, and then pipelines down here. Obviously, the entire thought behind this session is that you can actually collaborate around code. You can collaborate around consumer or customer requests, change requests. That might be bugs, that might be new features, new functionality. And you can actually do that using these work items that are the main project artifacts that are in Azure DevOps. You would be going in to create a backlog. So you would be asking your clients or stakeholders, what kind of functionality do we actually need in our solutions? And then go and create user stories, bugs, and so on to actually record any decisions made about functionality in here. So I've created a couple up front. The basic parts around that is that there is an owner of a user story, which means I'm the responsible personnel for actually taking this request into production. Usually a description in such a user story is, as a specific type of user, I want some goal so that I can fulfill any reason. So I might need a new button on a page so that I can click that in order to generate a specific CSV file or event in Azure or something similar. The description is one part of a user story. The acceptance criteria is actually the one that is targeted towards the developer. So this is where the developers need to focus because the acceptance criteria is actually describing in detail how you could test the code coming out of this user story. So this is a collaboration between the one with the assignment and the one or ones who are actually solving these tasks. In a user story, you can have multiple tasks. Those can be assigned to different developers. So you'd have to collaborate around creating this kind of feature or user story. In this one, there is a single task where it's common practice to actually break down the tasks in your work so that it's pretty fairly sure that you can actually achieve what you set out to in that specific amount of time. You kind of have to, in our setup, we have to provide an original estimate. That would be, is this a huge task or is it a light task? If it's a light task, then we can go and register it. If it's a somewhat unknown and therefore the developer is kind of, doesn't really know how much time it will take, then you have to break down into smaller pieces. So the rule of thumb at Catman is that this needs to be as small as possible and no more than a day. And the same goes for user stories. Rule of thumb is that tasks within a user story cannot exceed a sprint. So that comes down to, how do you define a sprint? Is that a week? Is 2 weeks, 3 weeks? How much time do you put in each iteration? On top of user stories, you can have other artifacts in Azure DevOps, so you can control if multiple user stories are tied together and so on. So you have kind of a management tool around that. As you can see on the right side, there's a link to releases and pipelines and so on, and we will dig into that later on. Sorry. Once I've created my backlog, I can create new items so that I can, take new requests in and so on, and I can use the tool to actually plan various iterations so that I can, see who is booked for how much time, and do we have any spare time on developers and so on. So I can actually use this as a resource planning tool as well. For each sprint, now this is the main backlog. This is for all the requirements in the company or in the project. Divided into sprints, I can dive into each individual sprint. And I can see kind of swim lanes as you would with Post-its. So now you can see that do stuff in here doesn't have any tasks. If I create a new task, child, it will pop up for the developer. Add a description. And all these red warning signs is something that you can configure within Azure DevOps, so that you ensure that the developer or people doing these planning efforts actually fill in on the right spots. So I can see original estimate is 2 and remaining is 2. So once I get going on the task, I can say maybe I completed 1 hour and then I have still 1 hour and 50 remaining, for instance. So when this is added, I'll have to refresh this. Oh, I didn't. Yeah, well, the thing is that when you create the child in here or in the sprint, it will automatically inherit the iteration and area and so on. Even tags, if you put tags on, those will be inherited to the new tasks. And now I can actually, as a project participant, see who is doing what, because this will obviously contain a lot of user stories and a lot of tasks and bugs and so on. So I can have a quick overview, just as if you would with a whiteboard with Post-its on it. And once I'm done, I can close the item. And now you see there's an error because I need to state how much time did I actually spend on this particular task. So I spent 1.5 hours, and now I can close it. So management-wise, you now know that the task is done. But how do you track what you thought would be done towards the code that is actually done? And for that example, we will go into Visual Studio to create a new project. We'll just create an Azure function in here. We will just create a, let's call this Mark, in the hybrid virtual group. And this will create a Visual Studio project that is the basic framework for an Azure function. So in here, we have kind of a function name. We have some logging information. We can identify that if we provide a query tag name, you can actually do something with that and so on. But this is just a basic setup for an Azure function. Now, how do we connect this up to Azure DevOps? It's gotten a lot easier over the years, and for now, it's actually doable in 2 ways. So right-clicking the solution up here, there's an option, create Git repo. And when I select that, I get the option to either create a new GitHub repo, a true GitHub repo, or an Azure DevOps Git repo. So I'm selecting the Azure DevOps Git repo. I'm selecting my organization. based on my login. So the login in Visual Studio is actually determining what projects I can see in here. We can see that there's a hybrid virtual group, and I want the repo to be called function app mark. Yeah, let's do that. So I create push. And now all of a sudden we see tiny icons next to the files that weren't there before. And these indicate changes and how Git is actually tracking these files. Currently, I have no repo out here in the DevOps. Actually, there is a repo created. And I can see that this is actually identical to what I have in my folder down here. So if I extend this with a comment, I can see there's a tiny check mark next to the function1.cs file, which indicates that there is a change compared to what's out there in the master. And for changes from my laptop to go into Azure DevOps, I need to complete a number of steps. And some of the step names is like, eating soup with the wrong end of the spoon, because you're actually pushing, but it's called pulling, and pulling when you're pushing, and so on. But eventually you will get into the hang of the naming convention around Git. It took me some time, and I'm sure you will get your head around it as well. So Git changes is another tab in Visual Studio. I can see that I'm connected to master. I've add comment mark, and now I'm committing my change, but I'm actually just committing it to my local repo. So Git is actually running a local repo on my machine, and I need to push that out into Azure DevOps as well. Up here in the top right corner, we have a set of icons. This one is called fetch. And fetch is checking whether there are changes on the server side that you don't have locally. It's not pulling them down, but it's checking if there are any changes. Then the one in the middle is actually forcing you to take in any changes that are out there into your local repo. And the final one is actually pushing changes into the main master repo. So I select push. And now it's pushing into origin master, it says. And let's go back into Azure DevOps and see that we have EA mark coming in here. Now, in order for us to actually check anything in here, there are two paths we can go by now. So either we check into automation first, or we check into change tracking and governance on that. And let's just pick automation first. So we've pushed our changes into our repo, and we can actually, on the front page here, see my commit comment, add comment on mark, which is different from the other ones. And we can also see that I'm currently in the master branch. This is something where you would, if you are more than one developer on a project, you would have multiple branches. So a master for what's in production, and then a development or develop. You define your own naming convention where you can actually test local changes and see them merge together. If you have multiple sources for coding coming in, then you would merge them into the development and then pull request them into master, as we see later on. But one giant button in here in the repo is this setup build, which actually allows me to set up an automated build pipeline in Azure DevOps that actually automatically pushes my code changes into a running service. So when I click that, it says, okay, so you need to configure a pipeline, and this is a YAML-based service. So what it actually does behind the scenes is generating YAML. And I strongly advise you to go into YAML using the GUI first, and then actually typing in the language later on, because YAML is very sensitive to spaces and tabs and ordering and so on. So it can be really frustrating to actually go into YAML if you only have Notepad, for instance. There are some out-of-the-box options for pipelines in here. One of the first ones is the .NET Core function app to Windows on Azure. That's the one that I'm interested in because I have an Azure function that I want to publish to a Windows function app. So when I click that, it's looking into my subscriptions based on my credentials in here. And I'm going to pick the Catman Classroom. And maybe we should go to that one first. So I have already created some of these services beforehand. This is actually also doable from within Visual Studio. Right-clicking the project and clicking Publish actually allows me to define where do I want to publish this and so on. I can set up and create new if I want to do test or development setup. I can create new Azure function endpoints and so on. So I can do that actually from within Visual Studio. That differs obviously if you are using a SQL Server project, but that's also supported in Visual Studio. It's just a different wizard you have to go through, and you can use that with publishing profiles and so on. So that's supported as well. So I created earlier today, there's a storage account attached to a function app, and then there's a app service plan, which is consumption based. So I can't really touch any of this. It's just tracking usage on this function in order to send me a bill afterwards. So I select Catman Classroom. This is where the resource group hybrid virtual group is. I need to log in. Some things are inevitable, and two-factor authentication is set for this. And now Azure DevOps browses the resource group and says, oh, I found function app mark, blah, blah, blah. Do you want to deploy into that? Yes. Validate and configure, please. And what Azure DevOps does now is that it's generating this YAML code behind the scenes. And there is actually one change that we need to do to this, which leads us to generating another branch for the code. Because out of the box, Azure DevOps has not kind of adopted to .NET 6, even though .NET 7 came out, I think, yesterday or this week. So we need to reference another build agent image in order to be allowed to actually deploy .NET 6 code into here. This should be done in a matter of seconds. There we are. And not going into too much detail here, I just want to highlight this VM image name, where it's currently referencing a Windows 2019 image, and there are several documented images that you can use. You can even have your own build agent completely configured like you wanted to, and you can reference that in here as well. You can either use Windows latest or Windows 2022, I think is the other option you can use. So we can choose save and run. I can also extend this pipeline by selecting, oh, right, I want to install blah, 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 and I want to invoke a REST API. I want to do all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of things you can do in this pipeline. We'll just keep it simple and click save and run. And now, since I did some changes, I think I will create a new branch because this saves me some time. And I will then click save and run. So now we told Azure DevOps, please create a pipeline that is used to deploy this Azure function. And it also stated where to deploy it. And also we created a different branch. So we created kind of a copy of the code that is now called development. And that's actually the code that I'm deploying in this pipeline. So that's where the focus needs to be in order to, have the proper release gates for your code. What artifact am I actually putting into production? So currently we are running on development, and I can even see the commit hash kind of key for the changes that I've made. I have full reference, so I can go back and see, oh, so this is where I added my YAML to my project. So actually now, if I go back into Visual Studio, this file will not be part of the project. And I can go in and say, so I'm on the master branch. And the master branch doesn't have this YAML script yet, because currently it's just living in development, but I actually have a way of reaching that. So currently we can see locals, there are master and remotes origin master. But if I go into manage branches over here and select fetch on the remotes origin, this one, it will actually pick up that there is a new branch out there, development. And if I select checkout for that, we can now see down in the corner here that I'm in development branch, and also that there's a new file associated to the project. So this is the YAML file. And as we can see, it's the YAML file that is defining the pipeline, which is now part of the project. So every time I change anything in the pipeline, that's a valuable lesson as well, I actually kick off a new pipeline build. So one of the first changes you want to do to a YAML file is in this trigger event, you can have a filter for excluding various file types, and you would probably want to exclude YAML file extensions from triggering a pipeline release. Now, this release usually takes a couple of minutes. I can go back and check on the pipeline. So we've established that we could actually build the artifact, as we can see down here. There's one artifact it's building. That's the YAML statement that is creating that. And now we've deployed our code into production or development or wherever we put that. So when I refresh this page, go into the Azure function, I can go see the functions. This is called function 1. And I can then, in this code and text test section, this is just to show you that we can track the changes. I get a function URL, and just pull up a new window. So now we can see that, all right, so this clearly says pass a name, mark, into the query string, which means that this is actually this piece of code that is running. So if I were to change this into Michael, we can again see that there's a little check mark in here. I need to commit to Michael, save and commit. And then I need to push it. And notice that I'm pushing it to development, because this is the next big step in this process. Currently, my pipeline up here, function app mark pipeline, is triggering on master, as we can see in this one. So actually, this is only triggering when master changes occur. So now I just pushed into development, and there's no invoking of this pipeline. But how do you collaborate on code changes? If we go in and see the branches in here, we can see that I'm some changes ahead of master because I'm comparing to master. So I know there's changes in development that I haven't merged into my master branch. And it's also giving me a fair warning up here. It says you updated development just now. Do you want to create a pull request? Yes, please let me create a pull request. And this is where eating soup with the wrong end of the spoon is actually in full throttle mode for me, because now I'm actually pulling from development into master. I'm not pushing, but yeah, no, let's not go into that. A pull request is comprised of a number of elements. The overview is where I can, I changed the name. I can make a description, a title, and so on. And I can also check in some of my co-workers to actually either be optional reviewers or required reviewers. So in order for this code merge from development into master to succeed, I can require some of my co-workers to actually go through the code. And what they will see is this. They will see, okay, so you added a YAML, and you also changed Mark to Michael. I can approve of that. It's easy as long as the changes are small. So keep your commit statements or your commit sets small. That way it's easier for others to actually tag along and figure out what you're doing. Another crucial element is that you can tag work items in here. So you can link these work items to actual code changes. And once I create this pull request, I will, because I tagged myself as a reviewer, I will get a notification by email saying, Jens wants you to actually check this code in this pull request. Please go and complete this or approve if more developers are in the loop. You can go in and see there's changes to the Azure pipeline YAML, and there's also to the function1.cs, and you can see them side by side. You can inline modified content and so on. Usually I have side by side. That's sometimes for me the easiest part, actually pinpointing what are the changes really. Once I complete this, the code will be merged from development into master. And as we saw, the YAML file was defining that only changes in master will kick off the pipeline. So I would assume that the pipeline would be kicked off after this pull request is completed. I have some options. I can complete associated work items after merging. We don't do that. We would like owners of work items not to be the same as developers. And work items we check in on are on a user story or bug level, not on a task level, because it makes it easier to find code changes by using user stories or bugs. I can delete the branch after merging. And this is where, if you have a lot of developers, you would be using feature branches. So actually development will be branched out into a feature branch, and you will delete that afterwards. That's a common practice as well. I complete the merge, and I can close the pull request. Now, if we go to pipelines, I can see that there's a blue icon next to the pipeline, which means it's queued. So now it's actually waiting for a build agent in Azure DevOps to become available. And if we go in, we can see that it's still not started, acquiring an agent from the cloud, request queue position, blah, 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 blah. And in time, this will kick off and do a deployment, just as we saw before. So if we go back and see, this took 3 minutes and 8 seconds, and that might be a long time to deploy something as simple as this. I can do that by right-clicking in Visual Studio and I'm off. But sometimes these setups are more complex, and that's where this automation part is actually very helpful to you. We'll see how this comes along in a second and move on to actually where I think Azure DevOps has one of its finest features. Still not doable in the pipelines, but in releases, which is maybe where you compose your entire release. So let's say you have a setup where you have databases, you have .NET code, you have Power BI reports, maybe analysis services, blah, blah, blah. You have a lot of moving parts, and you want to kind of orchestrate that release into a unified release. That's where you pull in releases, because you can control kind of the events that lead up to a release. You can gate them, set them to occur in the weekends or whatever you like. That's where you do that. So let's create a new, and this is also confusing, called pipeline. It's actually a release pipeline. And this has a visual kind of layout or UI. It shouldn't be doing this. That's odd. No, okay. We'll try.
I did wonder, Jens, because it look. Have you still got a build that's running in the background? Because I thought I saw one. So I do wonder if it's a capacity issue.
I don't think so. So, but let's just check if we can cross-project deploy. So I will create a new release pipeline in another project. This is another demo we're running. And as you can see, this is a bit of a different setup. So more UI-based out of the box. I can say, so this is, I want to deploy a function, and I can apply that kind of setup to configure my stages and tasks. So this is function, and I can also always change this afterwards. What I need in this release pipeline is one or more artifacts. And as we just saw before, the pipeline is creating an artifact, and I am able to actually dive into that artifact in here. So let's just see hybrid virtual group. We have function add mark, and that we will use as source alias. We can specify that I want to have some kind of special version of it. I always want the latest. And then I check this little flashy icon up here and says, I want this to be enabled, the continuous deployment trigger, which means that this release will actually occur if the build pipeline that we just created is succeeded. I can also say that I need a pull request trigger to be completed on the master branch so that I ensure that there's a code review before I actually launch anything into production. So now this one is a pull request deployment. And I can also schedule this. I can do kind of filters on it. I can gate it. I can do a lot of stuff in here. But the main meat, so to speak, is in the tasks. So for each stage I have in here, so let's say this would be a Q&A. I could have a copy of production down here. So this would be Q&A, and this would be production. And I could configure those stages to do completely different targets, but completely the same piece of code. And that's the main important aspect to keep in mind. I have one artifact that I'm carrying on into all of these different environments. Now let's just delete this one again. So we're back to production. And in here, I have a Azure Function app, and it did this to me earlier. So we'll just to see, I can deploy all kinds of different stuff in here, Azure Functions. And now I can see that, let's see, Captain Classroom, Function app for Windows. I can see that I need to configure an Azure Service Connection. It's because I'm in a different project now, Fellowmind demo. So I need to authorize, and for that, I need to put in my super admin credentials. Luckily, I'm super admin. So now Azure DevOps is creating a connection behind the scenes from Azure DevOps to Azure in order to be allowed to deploy, from the code repo into Azure. So that's what I'm allowing it now. Once it's done, we should be able to see function app mark in here. And let's just call this like this, and I can save it. So you might ask yourself, what is the difference now between the pipelines and the releases? Well, currently, a pipeline is triggered whenever changes to code come into master. And now this is triggering as soon as the master branch is built. So as soon as the master pipeline has run, then we want to release this piece of code. But that's actually only because we set the continuous development, the deployment trigger to this function. It could have been on any number of artifacts in here. So that changes will actually force this release pipeline to run whenever changes occur in various different projects. But one of the major benefits of having a release, other than actually being able to orchestrate all your moving components, is that you can actually roll back. So if I create a release manually, we see that I can actually, pick the artifact for function app mark. I could have selected this one. So Azure DevOps keeps a copy of my code for a given amount of time. I can actually enforce Azure DevOps to keep it indefinitely. I think the default standard is 30 or 60 days. But as I've created these today, it will it'll keep all of the copies from today at least. I can now create a release into production with the previous version of the code. So a release has been kicked off, and this is running somewhat similar to the actual pipelines. We can see that this has not been deployed yet. And that's maybe because I need to trigger it. That. And now it's queued and it's configured to run on an agent. I just need to check if we have the proper agent for that. I hope so. So you can select the image on the agent pool as well, or you can have your own image that you run your releases on if you need a special Power Query code or something like that. Yeah, I can see that I failed because the agent needs to be. Let's just kick this one off. Windows latest. So going back to version 1 of the code, and I can obviously the naming of the release, I can control that in here there are a number of predefined variables and so on I can add to the release name. In here, retention, as we spoke about, 30 days. It will keep all of these releases to save the changes. And this is not being kicked off because I need to click deploy. So while it's running, we'll go back to the pipeline, which is in the other project. Let's go for hyper virtual group pipelines in there. And we can see that actually completed in 3 minutes and 15 seconds as well. We can track whatever steps it's doing in here. And as soon as your YAML becomes more elaborate, you can create stages, and you can even have outsiders verify and check that you can move forward within these pipelines. We have one such setup where a client receives an email outside the AD or the Azure Active Directory of ours, so that they can approve once they have completed their testing in the Q&A. They can just hit a button in their email program, and then the pipeline will continue to roll into production. Okay, so let's go back to this one. Oh, it's still failing. Okay, this is weird. Maybe, yeah. So it's because of the cross project thing. Let's see if we can get off a release over here. Yes. So we'll just be very quick about it. This one. This one. Function. There we go. Now I don't need to authorize because I have one already set up for this project. So I can tap into Azure using that kind of subscription connection. And let's see, this one we need to change to latest. And just for the fun of it, save and create release. And we wanted the first release. So now it's called Jens release 1. And as we can see, it's queued. It's waiting for an agent to come online. And as we can see in here, let's see if we can, yeah, so the current version of the function is returning Mikhail as the example. And once this has run, this should be a minute or a half, we should be back to Mark actually being the example in the Azure function return statement. So looping back into why is this really handy, it's because sometimes you release stuff into production that shouldn't have been released, and you really want a fast and secure way to get back to the point before you made that error. And this is actually a very powerful tool to get you back into that state. And obviously, some of you may sit with the question, yeah, well, it's really not that simple, Jens. What about data? What about changes in other systems and so on? True, there are complications once your applications become, interleaved with a lot of, services and so on. But nonetheless, this is, bulletproof in terms of not making any mistakes in production, typos and so on. So that gets you a good way. So now we can see in the background that the release has run with the previous version of the code. So now that I rerun the function, I can see we are back to Mark. So this would, kind of give me the whole tour code-wise. And if I look back into my sprint, I can just check up. No, that was not the work item that I tagged in there. That was do more stuff, right? No. New items, that was it. So I tagged this in my pull request, this specific user story. And now I can see in the development section of that user story, I can see the code changes that are related to this user story. So I can actually go in and check. say, I wanted this functionality. What did you actually put in? Let me just check into the files. Oh yeah, I can see that you changed Mark to Michael. I'm happy. Great, thank you. And sometimes, that's for some, project stakeholders. They want to do that kind of nitty-gritty, changes to that. But we use that. Actually, we have tied it up into the releases into test and production. So if I go in, this is our actual production setup. So let me just go back to the previous sprint and see if we can find this one. Yes. So we can see here that this kind of code change, this was the task assigned, and we can see that these are the code changes made. But most importantly, we can see that test deployment of the tabular models in Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish have been succeeded, and also in production. So this is an easy way for the stakeholder to actually verify, okay, so we come by testing and we are in production with this feature. I can now close this user story as done. And that kind of concludes my circle all the way around from actually defining the task in words and in collaboration with stakeholders and the developers, going into the code, automating the deployment, and then actually looping back into being able to verify that the requirements that I requested up front are actually rolled out into production. Mark, do we have any questions?
Yeah, that's great stuff. So the first question we had was early on when you were doing the boards. The question is, do you have any advice as to what process type I should use for my boards?
Oh, yeah. Well, we've been through a couple. We've even designed our own and then went away from that again. Currently, I think we are using, let's just see, process automation. That's the one. So we're using DevOps. There are these basic, Agile, and Scrum CMMI. That's the main. And then we kind of specialized into a Catman and then actually also a DevOps. And it comes down to how do you want to treat bugs? What's your hierarchy of work items? Currently, we use epic, feature, user story, and bug, and task. We don't use any of the other stuff. And maybe that's even too much for small projects. Currently we have about 300 combined user stories bugs in the system that we're kind of tracking. And for that amount of work items, we need features and epics to actually control when do we want to release what and so on. If you have far less, then by all means, a more Kanban-like style is feasible, and user stories and bugs will do just fine. You might not even want to go to task level. Also, I saw a presentation once where a guy said they had tasks for 15 minutes. That was the lowest grain that they had. But that's sounding like they need to manage a lot of tasks and process in their setup. So that might be a bit too much for me.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I've found myself. It's a matter of trying to feel your way, isn't it, with the customized process?
Yes.
Okay. We've got a comment from Joe. A big up to Joe, who says that was a fantastic demo. Huge thanks. So thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thank you.
Next question: do you use a particular branching strategy for your CI/CD repositories?
Yes, as I talked about earlier, and maybe the most easy way to actually display that is that in Visual Studio, I know maybe you're not all using Visual Studio, but there's an extension in here. Let's see, installed extensions, and then I can't remember the name. It's called Git Flow. This one. This is actually dictating names of branches and so on. So when I'm in here, Team Explorer in Visual Studio, there's a Git Flow button, and when I start a new project in Visual Studio, I can click initialize on that, and then it says, okay, so production branch is master, development branch is develop. Each feature branch that I use is feature prefixed, release branches are release prefixed, and hotfix branches are hotfix prefixed. This is a bit too much for us. We don't use release and hotfix branches, but since we have multiple developers on the same kind of code repo, we like to have feature branches where each individual developer is actually developing on a specific feature of the code, and then they pull request into develop. And once develop is stable and fixed, we pull request from develop into master. And feature branches are then deleted once user stories are closed. So that's how we use it. There are a myriad of ways of actually setting up and branching strategies. There's maybe one or two other sessions, complete full-hour sessions, if you want to go into detail on maybe the most common ones, but keep it simple to begin with, master and develop maybe, and then if you expand, move into the feature branching strategy.
Okay, another one on branching. Can I prevent development changes directly to the master branch?
Yes, and that's a perfectly good question. I had a note on showing that. So when I have my branches in my project, so I have my repo in here where I have my branches, I can set up policies for each branch. And now this is maybe a limited set of verifications, but I can require a minimum number of reviewers to actually merge changes into a branch. So I can say minimum 1. I can even allow myself to approve my own changes, but I don't want to do that. We don't do that. We have 2 reviewers of all code changes. We can check for linked work items. So we need to hook that up into a user story or a bug. And any comments that have been done in a pull request, so you can discuss code changes in the pull request. It's like when you do a pull request, you have kind of a in-between state of development and master, and you can discuss code changes and do changes there while it's in the pull request state. And then you can have it required that all comments are resolved. So you've come to a conclusion that everybody's happy about, and you need to do that as well. I think actually we have all 3 for our production environments and none of them for development. So development, you can just chunk in whatever you want, but once you want to go into master, all of these 3 have to be, governed. You can even have build validations run before you can check in code and so on. So you can run tests on copies of the code and so on.
Okay, let's move swiftly on. So interesting question here. So if you, do you always use YAML pipelines for builds and classic pipelines for releases? Is there a reason for doing this?
That's the tool, how it's set up. So releases is a completely different UI. You haven't got the ability to create YAML pipelines in releases. That's actually, until a year ago, there was a classic option within pipelines. Let's see if we can still, yes. So there is the classical editor, which is still available. So you can create a pipeline without YAML. So it's the same experience as releases. Releases is only in classic mode, so to speak. You can't do YAML in releases.
Next question. If I wanted to do development on a budget, which we all like to do, could I use Visual Studio Code instead? Does it provide the same level of integration with Azure DevOps as Visual Studio does?
Yes. You can hook up to DevOps with Visual Studio Code as well as Visual Studio.
Right, so that moves us on to the final question, unless someone gets in really quickly. Did you say that your service connection to your subscription for deployment requires subscription administration rights, even if you just wanted to deploy to a specific resource group always?
Yes. So in order to create the connection between Azure DevOps and Azure, you have to be somewhat of a elevated permission state on both platforms. So in order to create the connection in Azure DevOps, you need to be some sort of admin on DevOps. I'm not sure which one. We've had examples where some of the employees in here were actually elevated enough, but couldn't. And then, yeah, well, so you have to be elevated in DevOps in order to actually create the connection from Azure DevOps. And you also need to be at least contributor on the resource group in order to create the connection to the resource group in Azure. So the service connections out here, we can see that I've created 4 different service connections. So it's actually creating a kind of an application account in Azure. So in the AD Active Directory over here, it's creating an app registration. Let's see these ones. So we can see there's a Philomine demo, which I created today, and I've created these for app registration. So you need to be able to create app registrations within Azure and also have access to, on contributor level, to the resource group that you want to connect to.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we don't have any more questions, so that concludes them. Massive thanks, Jens, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.